unmute yourself, please.
Thank you so much, Nemo. I appreciate that. I appreciate being invited to participate in this esteemed panel. And thanks to the Health of Mother Earth Foundation for putting it on. This project has been a long time coming. I began researching the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa when I was researching my book, Eating Tomorrow, which came out last year. But we really wanted to update that, and that research, which was commissioned by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Foundation and other allies, has resulted in a background paper of mine and in the report False Promises, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which came out last month. So what I want to do briefly is highlight the main findings from that report to open the discussion with our panelists. Next slide. So as I said, this was published by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Foundation with a coalition of German and African groups listed here. They also commissioned case studies for the report on Kenya, Mali, Zambia, and Tanzania. And as I said, my research laid the background for essentially doing an impact assessment of whether AGRA and the larger Green Revolution project was bringing anything resembling our Green Revolution to Africa in terms of the goals AGRA set initially. Next slide. As Nemo said, the organization AGRA was founded in 2006 with funding from the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundations. Since then, it's gotten about $1 billion in funding, about 2/3 of that from the Gates Foundation, and made about half of that, used about half of that funding in grants to different countries who are participants in AGRA. These 13 in this list were the main ones that AGRA has funded. Right now, there are only 11. Niger and Zambia were not in AGRA, and now Zambia is considering rejoining. But this gives a sense of the level of grants that have been dispersed since 2006 through 2018. The goals AGRA set were that by 2020, I'm sorry, back to the previous slide. Yeah, the goals it set were to double productivity and double incomes for 30 million small-scale farming households in Africa, in its target countries, and to cut food security in half. We made a point in this report of not just focusing on AGRA itself, because it's very difficult to discern much of any direct impacts from AGRA's own work. But it is part of a much larger Green Revolution project. We would say it's driving the policy narrative for African governments. And those governments have provided as much as $1 billion a year in subsidies for the purchases of the commercial seeds and chemical fertilizers that AGRA is promoting. So it's not just the 1 billion from AGRA that is driving this. It is dramatically the support of African governments. Next slide, please. So quickly, the main findings. We found no evidence of 100% increase in productivity. That would be a doubling of productivity. Even for maize, which is a favored crop, favored by AGRA for its promotion and favored by input subsidy programs. Most of the programs go to support the purchase of seeds and fertilizers for maize. But productivity is only up 29% compared to a 100% goal. In a broader basket of staple crops, you see only a an 18% increase in productivity. This is slow by any standards. This is very slow productivity growth. We also found that the subsidies that were being provided expanded the land planted to the favored crops more than it expanded yields. That's a problem because the goal of sustainable intensification, as it's called, is to get more food out of the land that's already planted and not increase the ecological footprint of agriculture on new lands. We found no evidence of incomes doubling. Poverty was still high and in most of these countries, and dramatically no evidence of improved food security. According to FAO figures, there was a 31% increase in the number of undernourished people in the 13 AGRA countries. Only 4 AGRA countries showed a decline, and in 9, the number of hungry actually increased. The conclusion of the study is that the Green Revolution model has had 14 years to prove itself, and it's failing. We think agroecology offers much more. It offers lower costs to governments and to farmers, and the farmers will see higher net returns because their input costs are not so high. They'll get diverse and more nutritious crops and diets for their food security, and it'll restore soils and provide other environmental benefits. Next slide. So this is what it looks like. Again, the first 2 bars are AGRA's goals: 100% increase in productivity, a 50% decrease in food insecurity. What they've actually achieved is an 18% increase in productivity, and not a decrease, but an increase in undernourishment. So next slide. This tells a story. I think the basic story that we'd want to tell about how the different ways this is failing. You see the goal of doubling productivity for maize. Total production has increased in AGRA countries by about 87% in this time period. And you could say, well, that's getting close to doubling. But the goal was not to double production, it was to double productivity. That darker green bar is the yield growth, the portion of that production increase that has come from productivity growth, and it's very low. The lighter green shows how much new land has been planted in maize, mainly because of the incentives given to farmers to cultivate maize. Give farmers free seeds and fertilizer to grow something, and they'll take it and they'll put new land into production to do it. They will also take land out of more sustainable and nutritious crops like millet and sorghum. So those next 2 bars show that millet production has declined 24%, millet yields have gone down 21%, and a lot of that land has gone into maize. Sorghum is a similar story. There's been virtually no yield growth. And again, we created our staple yield index, which combined a set of staple crops, cereal crops and roots and tubers, like sweet potato, cassava, to measure more broadly than maize. And that showed, only an 18% increase in AGRA countries. And again, the most astonishing figure is that undernourishment number, 30% increase in the number of undernourished people, according to the FAO, moving things in exactly the opposite direction. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is particularly alarming, the finding that there's a declining cultivation of traditional and nutritious crops. This graphic shows the difference between maize and millet, which I just described, a 24% decrease in millet production with an 87% increase in maize production. But it's not only that product that has suffered with the incentives to maize. Cassava has gone down 16%, 6% in yields, roots and tubers 7%. Sorghum, oh, we lost the screen. sorghum is
Can
that
you
just,
just keep working with the slides you have? Then there's some connection issues here, so you could just keep speaking on the slide you have, then we'll let you know when it's back on.
okay, that's fine. There we are again. Like I was saying, sorghum, which is also a staple crop and much more drought tolerant than maize, has seen just 3% yield growth, and groundnuts have actually declined in yields by 23%. So a remarkable decline of important nutritious crops. And that points to a decline in crop diversity and nutritional diversity, something that former FAO economist Jomo Kwame Sundaram wrote about in a column this week based on this report, calling out Agnes Kalibata, the head of AGRA, and the former agriculture minister of Rwanda for equating the production of calories, like more maize production, with a reduction in hunger. And these data show that they increased the production of calories in Rwanda, but they did not decrease the number of hungry. Next slide, please. The overall conclusion, again, is weak productivity growth with rising hunger. This chart will show you the different countries and their performance. The first column being staple yields index, that is the percentage increase in yields across a basket of staple crops. And the second column is the percent change in the number of undernourished in this AGRA period before AGRA started, 2004 to 6, average to 2016 to 18. Again, the track record is not good. Ethiopia is really the only country that shows a significant yield growth, 73%, still not at the 100% level that AGRA is shooting for, with a decline in hunger, a drop of 29%, also not up to the AGRA goal of cutting it in half. Ghana, Mali, and Malawi showed yield growth with some decline in hunger. But 4 countries have seen falling yields and rising hunger despite all this investment in the Green Revolution. That's Nigeria, Kenya, Burkina Faso, and Uganda. And 5 countries have shown slow yield growth, like AGRA, with rising hunger, like AGRA as a whole. The Rwanda figure is interesting, and I'll point it out because it shows a 24% increase in staple yields compared to a 66% increase in maize yields. That's what Agnes Kalibata and Rwanda are recognized for, is raising maize yields. But what we document as a 13% increase in the number of undernourished is actually far worse. The new FAO numbers came out last month and showed that that the increase in undernourished in Rwanda is actually 41% in this period that the head of AGRA is claiming as a success story. What we conclude from, actually, I think we missed one slide. Could you go back one slide? Not showing up. All right, let me just summarize what's on that.
It's coming out as blank, so.
Okay, yeah, I'll just keep going. It's a slide showing a little bit more of what's happened in Rwanda, and basically what you can see is all this. They tripled maize production. It's a striking story. You triple maize production, and you see a 41% increase in hunger in that same time period. That is a clear indictment of a model, and that's what Jomo Kwame Sundaram called out in his article, drawing heavily on this report. So to conclude, the authors of the report had the following conclusions and recommendations. Donor governments and foundations should immediately withdraw funding from AGRA. I'll point out that I asked AGRA to provide some of their own data for this study. And initially they said they would, and later they said they just fell silent and refused to provide any data at all. that would show that what benefits their beneficiaries are getting from these programs. So that's why we use national level data to say, is there a green revolution? Is there any evidence of a green revolution in these 13 countries? African governments, we recommend withdraw from AGRA and redirect spending now spent heavily on input subsidy programs to agroecology and other low input systems, much more favored by farmers. And that all governments and donors respect the right to food, peasant rights, and other international obligations. We make a point in the report to note that AGRA's director, Agnes Kalibata, has been named by the Director General of the UN to be his special envoy for an important 2021 UN World Food Summit. And we argue, I think pretty forcefully, that that such a narrow approach to agricultural development should not guide a conference that is intended to start from the premise that business as usual is not working and that we need to find new and diverse solutions to our problems. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Timothy, and for that very succinct presentation of the findings of the report and for some of the conclusions, especially the fact that the world cannot be led by somebody who is in charge of an organization that has such a narrow approach to food and agriculture. Those facts that you've brought are very disturbing. I'm sure participants have taken note of the figures and the facts. They can also download the full report from, I believe, the link will be shared in the chat box so that those who need to see the report can see it. But we're going to move straight on to the second presentation, and I'm going to be, Vandana Shiva can go in any direction she wants to go, but we'd like to hear her response to with the demonstration of the failure of the AGRA approach and other industrial models of agriculture. What are the lessons for African leaders going forward? And how do we move from the popular mindset that we cannot feed the growing African population? People always said Africans are multiplying, we are growing like rabbits, and how can we feed this rising population with the kind of agriculture that we're practicing, with indigenous knowledge and wisdom and practice? So Vandana, you have the floor to share your wisdom on this. I think you are muted.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you, Nemo, and thank you, Tim, for your excellent study. I was pushed into the Green Revolution, which is the GR part of AGRA, in 1984, when the state where I had done my MSc honors in physics erupted in violence. It had been a very peaceful state while I was doing my MSc. And it's the same state from where Devendra comes. It's Punjab, the land of the 5 rivers, prosperous, rich in resources, and the most hardworking farmers anywhere in the world. But 84, it was erupting in violence. And I did then, that's the book called The Violence of the Green Revolution for a United Nations University study on conflicts over resources. What we saw in 84 is exactly the same trends that the new report that Tim has just discussed show. A lot of people think that the Green Revolution was always, from the very beginning, about feeding the world. Those phrases did not even come up in the 60s or 70s. When Norman Borlaug, who is credited with starting the Green Revolution and got a Nobel Peace Prize for changing in agriculture, beginning with Punjab, he used to come to India and say, if I was a member of parliament, I'd get up every day and say, fertilizers, give me more fertilizers. So the Green Revolution from the beginning was about fertilizers, not growing more food. The problem was the native varieties, I say they do a satyagraha, which is Gandhi's word for civil disobedience and non-cooperation. Native crops don't cooperate with chemicals. They lodge. And let me read you from the person who actually implemented Borlaug's program for India, Dr. Swaminathan. He's admitted there's two facts that are very important for all African leaders to know. That the term high yielding doesn't mean the total output or even the total productivity of a plant. Swaminathan says high yielding varieties of wheat and rice are high yielding because they use larger quantities of nutrients in water than the earlier strains, which tended to lodge or fall down with the application of chemical fertilizers. They have a high harvest index, not higher production, not higher yields overall. Harvest index, which is the ratio of the economic yield, which means commodity, to the total biological yield, which is the biological productivity. And then he says it's more favorable to man, it's more favorable to business. Exactly as Tim pointed out, when the entire system starts driving farmers to grow a monoculture with chemicals, subsidies come and conditionalities come. I have done studies to show how no farmer chose chemical agriculture or the Green Revolution. They were pushed into it. Basically, you can have monocultures, and the point that Tim made, that more maize, more hunger, it's built into the fact that when you use precious land and water to grow a commodity, there will be less food for people. So overall, more commodities are growing and fewer people are having access to food. 1 billion people are hungry. I want to go back to the roots of the Green Revolution as a chemical revolution, or I would say war chemical revolution. I would like to remember at this moment the tragic Beirut blast, where an ammonium nitrate storage exploded. This is synthetic fertilizer, but its origins is explosives. And the same IG Farben that gave us the pesticides also gave us the synthetic fertilizers, BASF, the Haber-Bosch process. Explosives, the same process makes explosives from fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels at high temperature and then catalyzing the ammonia. And the same process makes synthetic fertilizers. Just think of the number of bombings. Oslo, Oklahoma, all bombings in Afghanistan. We brought war chemicals into agriculture, and the Green Revolution was the vehicle. Borlaug is credited with making dwarf varieties, but the chemicals were attempted to be introduced to India from 52 onwards by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. But the plants were rebelling. So Borlaug was given the work of making dwarf varieties with stolen seeds, the Norin wheat from Japan and the Dewanju from Indonesia. Since that time in '84, I have both been promoting biodiversity-based agriculture, agroecology, and changing the metric from the yield, which doesn't tell you what's the state of the farm, what's the state of the farmer, doesn't tell you what's the nutrition in the food, tells you nothing. It doesn't tell you what was the cost of input. It doesn't tell you how much energy was used. All it tells you is the commodity that flew, nutritionally empty commodities. So we evolved a metric first for productivity from, like I said, our production analysis has shown that with using native seeds, using the same amount of water and same amount of land that rice and wheat used in Punjab, we could grow the same amount of food. And I've had debates with the Borlaug Foundation on this issue. It's the land and water that explain the increase in production, not the productivity of miracle seeds. So we started to introduce nutrition per acre and health per acre, and we could feed 2 times India's population. So nutrition is what matters, not a commodity measure. Hiding all other costs that are borne by the farmer, the land, and the earth. We also started to measure true costs, net incomes. This doubling of incomes by shifting a farmer who has their sorghum and their millets and is eating them, and the community is eating them, into a maize and saying, I'll double income, is again deceitful because it's not counting the costs. And shifting farmers who support themselves with food into commodity farmers can increase the gross income, but it decreases the net income in a green revolution model. The costs are higher. That's why farmers in debt, farmers in India are committing suicide. So basically, I would say it's a halving of productivity and a tenfold decrease in incomes. In the early time of the Green Revolution, there were a few debates. And while I was doing this book, I was fascinated with the fact that Borlaug seeds to push more chemicals were called miracle varieties. The 12 people Borlaug trained to spread chemicals in agriculture and the Green Revolution, he had the arrogance to call them his apostles, as if he was Jesus Christ himself. And here is a quote I would like to leave you with. One way in which agricultural research, and I would say Green Revolution, went wrong was precisely in saying and allowing it to be said that some miracle was being produced. Historically, science and technology made their first advances by rejecting the idea of miracles in the natural world. Perhaps it would be best to return to that position and leave the issue of the sacred, the issue of miracles where they belong. The three main points for all African farmers and all African governments is measure true productivity, not pseudo-productivity, measure total output and true yields, not the fiction of high-yielding variety, measure the true cost and not the hiding the costs with a commodification measure, just like GDP only measures commodification of an economy, not the true production, not how much food do people have, not how healthy is the soil. And that's why there's questioning of GDP around the world and a shift towards well-being. It's time to question the high-yielding variety category. And the United Nations had already said, UNRWA had already said in the 70s, this is a misnomer. It should not be called high-yielding variety. They should be called high-response varieties because they are needed to respond to chemicals. And they need 10 times more water. Of course, they need more land because they don't grow in mixtures. They don't grow with diversity. They have to grow in monocultures because it's an intolerant kind of farming produced by a monoculture of the mind. And every measure, this is not science. This is commerce through war chemicals and deceit to take over the world. We are going to synthesize all the takeover by Gates, and Tim's summary will be part of it. But every sphere, from geoengineering to taking over seed, and this report will be issued in mid-September. Do look out for it on the Navdanya International website. And I know there is another webinar on the whole propaganda machine that's called the Cornyn Alliance of Science. What I have learned in these 36 years is public relations and propaganda is parading as science. Technologies to starve people are being offered as feeding people. This is foundational flaws, and we need to correct them from the very foundations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vandana. That's a lot of food for thought. We are going to just pause for a few moments for questions. And there are already some questions in the Q&A box and some in the chat box, while the panelists, both Vandana and Timothy, will look at those questions. Let me just stress what Vandana just said, that we have to look at nutrition, not commodification of our food system. Look at the health of the soil, health of the people, and very importantly, not called those so-called high-yield varieties, but call them high-response varieties. I think that's very important because they respond to chemicals. They need 10 times more water. They need more land. They grow in the outgrowths of the monocultures of the mind, not just monoculture of the land or the mind. So we need to decolonize minds and kind of change the imaginaries concerning how we grow food. So that's all. I don't know, Timothy, if you looked at the questions, some of the questions, and you have answers. So Timothy, you could just take a few answers, and then Vandana will respond to some of the questions. before
Sure,
we
I'd
go
be
to
happy to. Very good questions. And thank you, Vandana, for that excellent presentation. I think one of the things that I've said in the course of talking about this report is the thing that's striking to me is the Gates Foundation and AGRA are selling this as innovative technology in Africa. And in fact, they really are the failed policies of the past. And I think you're talking about the failures in India. They really are. These policies have been proven to be failures in the long run for soil fertility, for nutritional variety, for environmental sustainability. And it's a mistake to allow the promoters of AGRA and these so-called modern technologies to get away with claiming that this is the innovation Africa needs. It's actually discredited technology that's been proven to fail. One of the questions that was asked here, and I wish I had a better answer for it, is what's the reason Ethiopia has registered greater success? We've been looking more into that. It was not one of the focuses of my research in researching my book. So I'm a little hesitant to claim expertise myself. It was not one of the case studies chosen for the report. I think one of the case studies chosen for the report, though, I think gives a little bit of an indication why you might see better results in Ethiopia, which is that you also saw better results in Mali. And we have Mamadou Goita from Mali, who did that study, who can talk about the ways in which, yes, AGRA was present in Mali, but it did not completely drive the entire narrative. So there was, farmers had a lot to say about how policies were implemented. Basic rights in Mali were guaranteed for seed sovereignty, and land, and that made all the difference in terms of the impact AGRA had in that country. Ethiopia definitely deserves more attention. The other question that I think I'll take, because it's very much related to the theme of my book, the subtitle of which is Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food, is to what extent has the Green Revolution been in the best class interests of political elites? It clearly has. I mean, the clear winners from input subsidy programs, which are programs where the government puts vouchers in the hands of small-scale farmers to purchase these commercial varieties of seeds and fertilizers, are the sellers of those seeds and fertilizers. There would not be a market. Those products cost way too much for small-scale farmers to afford without subsidies. The subsidies put money directly into the hands of those companies, and in the process, try to get farmers hooked on that technology treadmill of depending on commercial seeds and fertilizers, seeds they have to buy every year, and fertilizer they need to make those seeds grow. I've said in the book that the first drugs are always free, and then you get hooked. The first drugs in this case are input subsidies, handing out vouchers to make it really cheap to get farmers hooked. I'll stop there and let Vandana continue.
So on the impact on African traditional seeds, the very fact that you're introducing new varieties, and Gates quite clearly eventually wants GMOs, is with the intention of displacing native seeds, because native seeds give sovereignty. And that's why, it's not an accident that while pushing AGRA, Gates has also been rewriting Africa's laws. He called a meeting in London where he called all the governments of Africa to have a uniform legislation. And if you notice, in country after country in Africa, saving seeds is being criminalized. This is the reason I started Navdanya, the movement for seed saving, to say saving seeds is our duty to the earth, to the farmers' rights, and to future generations. And we will never let it be criminalized. And we managed to win laws. Article 3J of our patent law, Article 39 of our Plant Variety and Farmers' Rights Act. So I think it's extremely important to recognize that Gates is after seed. In the new report that will be out in September, which will be like a follow-up of this, when I did the Green Revolution book, there was IRRI and the and CIMIC for the CGIAR system. These were public institutions, the World Bank controlled them. Today, Bill Gates controls the entire world CG system. He's talking of one CGIAR, one agriculture, Ag1, and he controls Svalbard where all the duplicate seeds are kept. So he is after seed, because once you control the seed, you control the food system. There's another question. I'm not taking too much time on this because we'll have more opportunities and we must focus on Tim's report. There's a question, given that there are multifaceted causes of hunger, including political factors, how did you conclude that the hunger emanated from failed AGRA goals? It's partly to you, Tim, but let me say from my experience, both of the Green Revolution study, as well as my studies since then, when you aren't growing enough nutrition and enough food, and you're not growing it in ways that people can have it, you're going to have hunger. So the Green Revolution doesn't produce food, it produces commodities. It doesn't produce nutrition, it produces nutritionally empty commodities. It produces these at very high cost, and I have watched across the country farmers who grew rice with costly synthetic chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, borrowed. I've seen tribals sell their silver jewelry, borrowed for this. And then they had to sell their rice to keep paying back the debt for war chemicals. And they sell the rice at 2 rupees, then they buy it back at 8 rupees. Half the hungry people of the world, of the billion people, half are farmers who produce food. But under a Green Revolution system, they're pushed into hunger. Half of India is hungry. Every 4th Indian is hungry. Half of them are farmers. So yes, it is about the politics, but the politics is linked to how you produce, what you produce for. And if the production itself was in a good shape, then pure politics would come into the role. But right now, an agribusiness model and Bill Gates and AGRA and Green Revolution and industrial farming are drivers of hunger, and you can't separate production system from distribution systems. The production system you design defines whether the food will be there and who will get it. And the production system designed by the corporations and by Bill Gates means the markets will get the commodity and the people will starve.
Yeah, Nemo, could I give a quick response to that question about AGRA being the cause of the failure and the cause of the rise in hunger? It's an important question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, briefly, we would never say that AGRA's policies alone have caused the rise in hunger in AGRA countries in Africa, nor would we say that the input subsidy programs themselves have created that hunger. What we would say is that the entire goal of increasing productivity and incomes for small-scale farmers is to address hunger. And a clear indicator that those policies are failing is that hunger has been rising in spite of this massive investment. Think about it, $1 billion a year invested by African governments, $1 billion over 12 years invested by AGRA and the Gates Foundation. And with all that investment, you still haven't slowed the rise in hunger. That's the indicator that we're looking at. There's obviously a lot of complex causes for hunger. The point, as Vandana says, the point of looking at small-scale farmers is that they're the biggest group of the hungry in the world. And these programs are failing to address that hunger that's affecting creating half of the severe hunger in the world right now.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thanks a lot, Vandana, for the comments and responses to some of the questions. There are a lot of questions. I believe that the next presentations will cover them. For example, there's one that talks about how to address the reality of what happens in institutions as part of the culture of so-called enlightened scientific learning. Maybe Devina would tackle that. I don't know. But Devina Sharma, coming to you now, would like you to, in your presentation, to touch on implications of farm subsidies on small-scale farm or smallholder farming, and what's the way forward, and also how can we win our politicians from staying stuck on the influence of corporate industrial forces such as AGRA, because AGRA is actually not a philanthropic enterprise, it's an industrial enterprise. So Devin, there you have the floor. Unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Nemo, and thank you to the Home Foundation for giving me this opportunity to be with you all and deliberate on AGRA. In fact, 2 days back when I put this the announcement on my Facebook saying that we're going to be discussing AGRA, there were a couple of people who wrote on my Facebook, "Oh, you're coming to our city. Don't forget Agra is the city of Taj Mahal." And they thought I was going to be in Taj Mahal. So that tells us that most Indians are not well aware of what is happening in Africa. And perhaps these kinds of deliberations and webinars would expose them to the realities. When Tim said, and Vandana, of course, is known for saying this, that it is a failed promise and it is a failed model, I don't think any one of us was surprised. Because it is a failed model, which I don't know why the world hasn't learned a lesson and is trying to push it on to Africa. A failed model which failed in India, which failed in Europe, which failed in America. And I think one of the best ways to understand this, of course, is what it has done to the environment and to the human health and nutrition and so on. But also another way of looking at it is what has happened to the farmers' income. I think when Tim said that one of the objectives of this AGRA initiative was to increase or to double farmers' income, I just want to draw the attention that in India, 60 or 50 years, 50 plus years after Green Revolution came in, the government has promised to double farmers' income by the year 2022. So it has taken more than 50 years, and we still don't know what exactly is the farmers' income. And we are talking of doubling farmers' income. Now, how does it fare in the rich countries and of course in countries like India? Why is it that the farmers, despite producing a record harvest every year, they still live in distress, and they face, whether in America or in India or in Europe, they are faced with a terrible, terrible agrarian crisis. I remember traveling in Europe recently, and I asked a farmer, do the younger boys in agriculture, living in agriculture families, do they get married? I was told, no, they don't get married. So I started looking more at it. I thought it was happening only in Punjab and Haryana and the rest of the country in India, that the boys who are in agriculture, the young boys in agriculture are not getting a bride nowadays. And I found that in France, for instance, they have a weekly reality show called Love in the Field, where they try to bring girls and boys onto the stage and hoping that some of them will go and settle down in the villages. Then I realized it's not only happening in France, it's also, I was told it's happening in Scotland. They have a show like that. It's a show is happening in Canada. So it tells us the social fallout of the distress that prevails all across the world, even in subsidized countries where we have heavy subsidies, being put in agriculture. The US Department of Agriculture, the chief economist, has recently gone on record saying that the farm incomes in America since the 1960s have been on a steep decline. This is happening in a country where we are borrowing the model from, the model of industrial agriculture, the model of pushing people out of agriculture into the urban areas. This is happening in that country, that the farm incomes are in steep decline. I recently read a study which tells us that the rural suicide, the suicides in the rural America are 45% higher than urban America. And another statement tells us that the bankruptcy that prevails in American agriculture has now touched $425 billion. Now, that tells us the severe crisis American agriculture faces. In Europe, the same situation, several I would say decades back, I remember a study by UK Food Group which told us that every minute a farmer quits agriculture in Europe. And the situation, of course, continues. And we know that despite $110 billion of farm subsidies being pumped in, European agriculture, as I explained earlier, which is evident from the social crisis that is existing everywhere, that means agriculture or the farmers are not doing well in Europe also. Now come to India. India is a land which is, of course, the harbinger of a green revolution, where we promise a lot to the world. As Vandana said, I live in Punjab. Punjab is the food bowl of the country. It's in the northwestern part of the country. And interestingly, Punjab has 98% assured irrigation. The recipe that we would be made to follow is that, we should have expand irrigation, and which will mean more productivity, and more productivity would mean that more income will come to farmers. But let's look at the classic example of Punjab. Punjab has 98% area under assured irrigation, which means every crop field gets its supply of water, regular supply of water. The productivity of the cereal crops, 3 cereal crops, wheat, maize, and paddy, is amongst the highest in the world. Now, that would mean that, everyone would believe that Punjab farmers are very progressive, doing very well, and are rich and prosperous. But on the contrary, if you look at Punjab, it has turned into a hotbed of farmer suicides. Between 2000 and 2015, a house-to-house survey has shown that in Punjab, there were 16,600 suicides happening in the 15 years. Roughly about 1,000 farmers commit suicide every year in Punjab alone. Now that tells us that there is something going terribly wrong. And I think we need to look into it. Why is it that agriculture, the way it is being promoted, the way it is being pushed, the technology intensive kind of farming has made farmers or kept them impoverished, whereas the income has passed on to the input providers. Now, if you look at India, we have been always saying that agriculture has been deliberately kept impoverished, because that's the design. The global design tells us that as long as we don't move people out of agriculture into the urban areas, because urban areas need cheap labor, there will be no economic growth. So countries after country, and of course we are also under pressure to push people out of agriculture into the urban areas. For a country which has 600 million people involved with agriculture, imagine the kind of chaos we're going to witness in the years to come, when we will be able to achieve what has been prescribed by the World Bank to us several decades back. I remember in 1996, the World Bank had told India to move 400 million people out of rural areas into the urban cities by the year 2015. This was in 1996, and in the next 20 years, they were expecting a population twice the combined, which is equal to twice the combined population of UK, France, and Germany, which was 200 million. So they were expecting 400 million to move people to move out into the urban areas. Now, when the pandemic happened, when the lockdown began, just 2 days of the lockdown, and the lifeline snatched, and we saw millions of people migrating back into the cities in India, walking for long distances over days with their children on their back and their baggage stuck with them. And they walked, and this exposed us to what I always used to call as agricultural refugees. The people who were pushed out of agriculture have been deliberately pushed out because you keep agriculture uneconomical, make it economically unviable, and the farmers were left with no choice but to get out of the rural areas into the urban areas. That policy still continues, and the kind of policy that we have, which promises get big or get out, that kind of policies that are being followed all across the world, I think is leading us to a situation where we see more mega mergers and companies take over, or the corporate takeover of agriculture. This is happening not only in India, but it's now scheduled to happen in Africa also. And I think Africans need to be warned as to where we are heading towards. If farmers' income is not increasing, as I explained, it has not doubled in India. And first of all, we don't even know what is the farm income. A government-owned study in 2016 told us that the average income of a farming family, which means roughly about 5 people in a family, average income of a farming family in India, in roughly half the country, which is 17 states, is just $250. You can't even rear up a cow in $250 a year. You can't rear a dog in $250 a year. Imagine how these families in half the country are surviving on $250 a year. This was a government-owned study. Another study tells us, which is from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in collaboration with the Delhi-based think tank. They have analyzed that between 2000 and 2016, Indian farmers lost roughly $600 billion. And this equals to 45 lakh crore, as we say in India. $600 billion which they lost, the farmers suffered. And then the government's own Niti Aayog, which is the planning body, has said that farm incomes in the next 7 years have remained near zero. The growth in farm incomes have remained near zero. The point I'm trying to make is for 2 decades, we know very clearly the studies done for India that the farm incomes have either been in the negative or have remained frozen. If that's the situation that the green revolution model has led us to, I think it is time to question, when will we see farm incomes rising to a level of where they can earn a decent living? I think that's a question that we need to understand and we need to really pose forward, besides, of course, the agroecological expectation that we have from a world which is now beginning to understand that the kind of cultivation practices we had were not conducive to the environment and to the society at large. I think Africa has a lot to learn from India. The promises that have failed, not only as was spelled out earlier in Europe and developed countries, but also in a country like India, which was and in many other developing countries that we know of, tells us very clearly that we need a new kind of a model for agriculture. It doesn't have to be the same kind of intensive farming driven model, which is pushing on the chemical inputs. I think we have to move away to non-chemical agriculture. Now, AGRA, I think, is a lesson for us that countries haven't learned, the leadership hasn't learned. Perhaps even the mainline economists and scientists and the policymakers haven't learned too, because it is not desirable to be politically incorrect, and so they tend to follow what is being proposed. But I suppose there are senior voices in Africa who I'm sure are understanding that this is not the model. You have to learn from India's mistakes, and since 1995, I think one way to explain that mistake is there are more than 330,000 suicides happening in India in the last 22 years. So that tells us that the cost of the green revolution has been borne by the farmers. The small farmers are the worst affected. And I think it is time to understand and how can we provide farmers with an assured income. That, I think, is the biggest challenge the world faces. Whether you are in the developed countries or whether you are in the developing countries, the biggest challenge farmers face is they need a kind of a farming system, which of course is ecologically sustainable and economically viable, but provides them with an assured income every month. That's the kind of model that we need to develop. We cannot leave farmers to the market forces. We cannot leave farmers to face the volatility of markets. It is time we really pull them out of the debt crisis, which is driven by the way the markets operate, and pull them out and provide them a decent living, a kind of a decent lifestyle or a decent livelihood. Now, that's a bigger challenge for us, and I'm sure how to provide farmers with an assured income is something that we would also be focusing on. In short, I would say that Africa actually didn't need AGRA. What Africa needed is something what I have been always saying, you need SAGRA, S-A-G-R-A, Sustainable Agriculture for Africa. I think that is what Africa needs. And I think it's time to get away from AGRA, from the failed promises. We need to really move on to a new normal. And the new normal is where farmers are provided with a decent living, decent livelihood. And of course, the food chain becomes free of the contamination that the world has seen. Thank you. I think I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Devinder, and thank you for leaving us with SAGA, Sustainable Agriculture for Africa. I note what you said about the fact that agriculture must be ecologically sustainable and economically viable, and that farmers cannot be left to the vagaries of the market, the volatility of the market. It just leads to more distress and more problems. So a lot of things to chew on that. And I think it's a good point for us to bring in Mamadou Goita at this moment to tell us about, he was one of the researchers and writers of the report that triggered this webinar. What has been the experience in Mali with respect to AGRA's work, and what should be the response of African governments to the findings of the report to which he so much contributed. I can't see, Mamadou, you are there, right? Mamadou, you have the floor. Yes, Mamadou, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, because I had a technical problem. So I hope that you can hear me very well. So thanks a lot for all these contribution by my predecessors, and it gives a sense of in which trap so Africa has been in for these last 10 years, 11 years of AGRA. And we have been drawing attention on this, what is happening today, since the very beginning, just to remind people that we organized the first big gathering against AGRA in the continent in Mali in 2007. That was a way to draw attention because we had already done some of the pre-assessment of what could happen with these initiatives from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation. That has been joined later on. We had so many events discussing about it. Just to give you a sense, since everything has been said on AGRA itself by my predecessors, I will emphasize on this topic of, is it possible for African farmers to feed Africa? Just for the sake of understanding some of the key points on AGRA in the case of Mali that I've been working on these last days, just to remind you that 53% of the resources that AGRA has been putting in the case of Mali has gone to the input system of the program, 53%. That 35% of the resources, in total they put, they said that they put 36 million US dollars in Mali, and it represents 1% of the annual budget of Mali for agriculture. So just to give you a sense also of what psychologically they have been pushing forward, showing the power of AGRA in terms of investment, that is like peanuts in terms of investment on the budget. So psychologically, countries have been trapped in, but if you look at how much they have been putting also in this, it's really a very, very small amount of money. And 11% goes to what they call support to the country. And that was supposed to go for all these policy change issues and so. So in Mali, why it didn't work? Because there was a strong farmers group that has been at the very beginning mobilizing and then fighting against this system and putting emphasis on the agroecological perspective for this country. Because AGRA came in 2006 and already 2004, Mali has started drafting what we call the agricultural orientation law. And that already put as a guidelines, the political guideline of this orientation law was full sovereignty and relying on family farm system. And that was already in the first strong policy document of Mali already in 2006, promulgated by the head of the state in 2006. So we proceeded also in drafting some of the other policy documents, mainly the agricultural land policy that had on the same line, and the seed policy also that is now reviewing, including the farmer seed system in the process. Just to come back on this, what is happening in this continent, I just want to remind you also that already in 2008, we did an assessment of where AGRA money was going. And we just realized that 51% of resources that was going in the continent there was an average of 442,000 approximately US dollar that goes to some of the individual projects. And that 49% of the resources were used to fund, to support US-based institutions. And most of this was members of CropLife. And you know that CropLife is the foundation for all these fertilizers companies and so. So if you look at that picture already, in terms of investment, all is problematic. But if you look at also the figures of this continent, in terms of food production and all the system that is around upstream and downstream, you just realize that, I'll take just the case of West Africa. After people have been accepting just to subsidize some of the production system, I'm talking about seeds, but in my country, for instance, more than 73% of the seed that you use in production system is recognized to be farmer seeds. If you look at that, West Africa is producing more than 59 million tons of cereal. That is far beyond our needs. If you look at the population of this region, just to give you a figure, I can go to West Africa, to Central Africa with Cameroon and some other countries, but also to East Africa. But I will give you the figures of West Africa. We just had these figures of a growth in some of these parts. After accepting that there is a need to put more resources on smallholder farming system, and put more resources on the agroecological system that is dominating the case of Mali. We have a growth of the production system that is really very, very useful to underline. So this growth of some of the production like millet and sorghum, with millet, for instance, with plus 23% growth in West Africa, has not been assisted by AGRA. And if you go to sorghum, it's about 18%. You look at the figures of 2011 and behind. So this led us to have this production that is already feeding the continent, the region of West African region. But you may say that there are some structural issues that are linked to this increase of the production system, for sure. That all the countries are in a position to increase their production in a sustainable way if you take out what goes on the fertilizers uses and so. Secondly, there is a key point that I want to highlight. So this is the structural issue that need to be addressed. You see a country like Mali, we are producing around in 2002, and it started increasing already with something like 2.5 million tons of cereal in the country, divided between dry cereals. Actually, we are around 9 million tons of cereal that is produced. If you take out, and the biggest share of this is on millet and sorghum, that didn't benefit from any support from the AGRA system. So this means that because of the push of farmers' organization to invest in some of these key segments of the food system has been very instrumental to this increase in the production. But still, you look at also the level of nutrition, so have also been improved. But if you look at that, you will see that most of these investment has gone in the agroecological system that has been pushed forward by smallholder farmers organizations like CNOP. That has been refusing completely to take any of the funding from AGRA in the country. So actually, Mali is one of the countries that is investing more than 10% in agricultural sector. We are investing 15%. If you take out the corruption side of it and some of the other figures that I will just leave it on for the sake of this debate, just to show that if the investment that our countries are doing goes on the food system, taking into account this issue of food quality, sustainability, and the sustainability of the food production system itself, that we not only will feed the whole portion of the population by increasing the processing and other segment of the system related to the territorial market, but also that we can be a net exporter of food in a sharing between different sub-regions of the country. So this figure for West Africa can be applied to other parts of this continent. We all know that the case of Morocco is a bit different. If you look at Africa, because it's a green revolution model. The green Morocco is a green revolution model, but the sustainability is questioned today because people have been producing, and then all this issue of sustainability. Because if you look at the fruit market, you look at the vegetable market and the cereal market, it has to be questioned on the line of what can be sustainable. But if you look at the kind of market that have been developed, mainly by most of the countries, so focusing on the territorial market, so consuming more than 70% of the production of this continent, we are sure that this continent can feed itself. Farmers, actually, without any kind of disturbance of the food production system, controlling better in a better way the food loss. That is about 30% in some part of this continent. That we can not only feed the population of this continent, but also contribute in a sustainable way to produce enough. And this goes also to reorganizing the market system. Which market are we talking about? Because if the debate about AGRA is also reorienting the production system to the international market. And we all know statistics shows that less than 20% of the food that is consumed go to international market. The rest of this food, where is it going? It's going to the territorial market. And this territorial market that are local ones, cross-border market also sometimes to some extent, that are linked to the food system, because this is the relationship between food production and the food consumption system. That is more cultural, as has been said, that reorganizing this kind of market will allow just to keep the production and also to add value in terms of processing. All these women groups, cooperatives, and youth groups processing this food need to be supported in that way. So yes, my answer is that African farmers can feed Africa and go even beyond that, creating more wealth in a sustainable way. But there are some structural issues that we need to address. This is about the policy level. We don't need this homogenization of policies, agricultural policies in the continent that AGRA is requesting and Bill Gates is supporting. So we don't need that because the contexts are not the same. The agroecological contexts are not the same, and the farmers are not at the same level of production. Africa is diverse, and we need to care about the territorialization of the territoriality of the system, food system, production system with laws that are related to that. We need to change our way of investing in this agriculture, because some of these, you cannot develop your agriculture with project models. It has to be a vision, and vision around food sovereignty should be also undermined in the policy document that we have. Also, the banking system, the funding system of agriculture need to be changed. We cannot rely on foreign investment. That will link to these land grabbing issues and all these kind of things. Thirdly, for me, what is useful is to work on the downstream issues. That is the losses that we are having after harvesting, and the processing small companies, SMEs that we have that need to be reorganized in a sense that to put more emphasis on this side so that cities can be fed by the rural areas in a very sustainable way, using some of these techniques and technology that are under control at that level too. And the third part is reorganizing the market. This market that we call territorial market, that is where most of the food is circulating, and then that is also linked to the cultural background of the food system of these different countries. So I will just emphasize on this point that there are some structural reforms that are needed in terms of policies, in terms of infrastructure, to allow those who are producing cattle in the north of Mali that don't have access to cereal to access to the cereal with good roll and all these kind of things, but also the processing unit that can help also to support some of the adding value part of it and then make it available for cities and all this like, and the agroecological perspective that people are pushing forward actually in the continent will be a key instrument just to put forward this objective and this ambition that we have just to clarify this contribution of smaller farmers in feeding the continent, but also creating wealth at all levels. So I will stop here, hoping that with questions and different things that we can contribute more to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Mamadou. Merci beaucoup. I'm sure you've triggered a lot of facts, and we're going to be going to comments and questions. But but before then, I'm going to ask Father Nedi to make a few comments here. We couldn't take his comments at the beginning because of audio issues. But let me just underscore the fact of what you said, that investment in agricultural production must be based on a vision. And that vision has to be agroecology. That's the best vision. Now people are propagating this vision. It's not an imported vision. It's an African way of growing crops in tune with the environment. And then we need infrastructure. We need the extension services. We need processing. We need to support local markets. The African farmers can feed us, can feed Africa and have surplus for exports. I totally